Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar on finding the right agent or distributor to grow your business overseas. Today's webinar will cover all the key aspects of finding the right agent or distributor, giving practical tips about how to meet your select agents and distributors, how to decide who to trust with selling for your business, and how to manage and extract the most value from that relationship. Today we have two excellent expert speakers for you. Firstly, we have Steve Smith from Hartwell Smith Associates, a consumer goods consultancy helping clients to gain distribution and maximize sales in the retail market. He will be giving you an overview of his wide experience of using agents and distributors, and especially building key retail partners. Steve will be followed by John Reed from Export Aid and the Institute of Export, who has over 30 years experience of selling into more than 40 countries. John will be giving you practical tips on managing your relationships with agents and distributors. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Steve to begin today's presentation.
Hello everybody, hopefully everybody can hear me now. Okay, good afternoon everybody. I'll try again, a little technical hitch there. So I was just saying, my name is Steve. I have a business called Hartwell Smith Associates where we help companies find distribution and retail overseas. I had nearly 30 years with the Polaroid Corporation, working 5 years in the Middle East with agents and distributors, and then running the export business for a further 5 years. My slides for the first 20 minutes focus on winning international retail. I appreciate not everybody will be within consumer goods and looking for retail, but I also move on to tips and help with agents and distributors. And then in John's piece that comes afterwards, we focus very much on that agent and distributor piece. So I'm just going to move from camera to full slide, and then I'll come back to you at the end. Okay, so we'll move on to the first slide. Please, Ian. There we are. Okay, good. So El Corte Inglés. Essentially, in my career with Polaroid, I managed the Madrid office for a year or two. The reason I've started with this slide is that a lot of people ask, how do you break into such key international retail business? How do you go about getting support through agents and distributors? And I just want to tell you a couple of stories throughout this 20 minutes. The first one being, if you've never been to Spain or never been into an El Corte Inglés store, they're absolutely magnificent. They're Europe's biggest department store group. So yes, they are bigger than John Lewis and the others. They have about 80 stores through Spain, a few in Portugal, and they turn over around 15 billion euros worth of business. Whilst I was working in the Madrid office, we actually approached El Corte about getting business in. We hadn't really established partner distributors, but they guided us to partners that they use. They so wanted our products, they guided us to agents and partners that they use. We teamed up with them, and we had a successful business up and running within a short amount of time. My point here is that there are key retailers throughout Europe, throughout international, that will be very interested to see and hear about the products that you may have. And it's not always, sometimes it's not always about setting up agents first. It's never a bad thing to approach the retailers themselves, please. So I'm going to talk about how do we make that link with retail and then on to distributors. And so we're going to touch on a couple of subjects, just a few minutes on each. Web versus retail. A lot of you may have web businesses that you drive and you are wondering about moving into wider distribution. Well, we'll talk about that. I'm going to talk about another fantastic opportunity that came from a short meeting with a retailer. So I want to talk about being speculative and about you being brave and being speculative in a I'm going to talk about what I call being a detective, which is what I am. It's about really pursuing switchboards or websites and really looking for the right partner or right retailer for yourselves. We'll touch on the role of the distributor, which John in his session will enhance even further. We'll talk on getting help and then stages in relationship process. So first of all, web versus retail. One thing that I hear from a lot of people is I want to expand my business, but at the moment I'm largely selling on web, on my own website, and of course I'm making 100% profit margins to a wider sphere of business and give away more of those margins. Well, you should certainly consider it. I'll give you an example of some web sales versus retail throughout Europe particularly. In the UK, we're very geared up to web business, purchasing on the web, selling on the web, and in fact this research that was done in 2015 had the UK at around 15% of sales being web driven. In fact, that figure is more like 18% now and rising. It's expected it will reach a saturation point of about 25% in a few years' time, but who knows. But my point here is that there are many markets in the world, and many in Europe, where the figure is closer to 3, 4, 5%, and I highlight Spain there as being 3.5%. That's actually increased to about 4.5% since this survey was done. But my point here is that within markets like Spain and Italy, there's over 95% of the market that's still through retail or other distribution. So yes, it's true, margins are greater on your website, but big volumes and strong revenue can come from retail partners. And establishing a partner in international markets, although taking a little time, can provide a regular, often one-drop shipment. Next slide, please, Ian. Quick 30, 60 seconds on an opportunity I had personally about 10 years ago, and this is really being speculative in your approach. So many people say to me, I've got this wonderful product, and very often they do, you know, how do I get into retail? I've got a couple of partners in the UK, but really how do I approach those markets overseas? And I say really it's about being speculative, it's about being brave, it's about putting your products in front of the right person, and that making, you know, web research or calling an international switchboard. We're very, very fortunate in the English language is so widely spoken, and so many people, when you ring them on a switchboard, want to help you by responding or find something that will help. So what was the opportunity? I happened to be at Polaroid where we sold cameras, and I ended up meeting a guy who was involved in the TV and electronics sector of a very large British retail chain, and we talked about the Polaroid brand. And he said to me, have you ever, you know, we've never really considered the Polaroid brand as anything other than cameras. And within about 6 months, we'd formulated a plan, and within about a year, we'd sold around about something like 20,000 TVs under the Polaroid brand through this retailer. And I'm not sort of blowing my own horn here. What I'm saying is it's really about taking that speculative discussion over a coffee and pursuing it further. Next slide, please, Ian. So I talked about being a detective. What are the stages? Next slide, please, Ian. Really, good research is key to uncovering details, whether you're pursuing a retailer, a distributor, or agent. But let's think about retailers. So internet searches, Googling, and gaining as much information you can about whether it's Globus in Switzerland, Metro in Germany, the French hypermarkets, American retailers, getting as much information you can from the web. Once you've narrowed it down, be brave. It's about calling retailer switchboards and trying to actually drill down and get names and contact emails and perhaps phone numbers. And if you're able to, it's all about visiting the store as well. I mean, I happen to travel through Europe, so whenever I'm in a particular market, I was in Italy 2 weeks ago, whenever I'm in a market, I'll always try and visit key retailers, just looking for what they stock, whether there's opportunity, because if you're going to talk to a buyer, you really need to be positioning your product where you think there's an opportunity. So let's say you've got the email, you've got the contacts. Your first method I would suggest is by emailing an introduction of yourself, of your product, in the most brief and concise way, you know, reasonably possible, stating the opportunity that you've seen or you think is there and the potential demand in the market. I always try and attach a little product service detail on behalf of my clients to stimulate interest. It could be just a simple PDF or a couple of images of the product. And always request a meeting. If it's in Portugal, you're going to be wanting to do this sort of thing by Skype. Businesses are geared up now to trade on Skype and you know, technology in a most efficient way possible. If you don't get a response, I always send a second email just reminding that you requested a meeting or a discussion and perhaps offer to send samples for viewing. I tend to do that in the second email. The success rate, I would say that the first email tends to get 10, 20, 30% responses, some people acknowledging and saying, okay, this is quite interesting, but a second email is usually stronger. And then if I'm not getting anything at all, I'm either thinking that this really isn't worth it, or sometimes I'll make that telephone call to actually follow up. And again, you'd be quite surprised how you get on. One thing I would stress, if you're calling retailers, I have a bit of psychology about when to call people during the week, and I never call a retailer on a Monday morning. Monday is really all about drilling down the figures over retail success over the weekend. Okay, so I've talked very much, I've talked a little bit about approaching retailers, international retailers. And I stress again, even if you haven't got a distributor in a certain market, I wouldn't let that stop you, approaching the key retailers there and asking them for guidance and help. Because if they really like your product, like the opportunity, they'll certainly have other people supplying them on behalf of other products and companies. So a little word on distributors, and then, as I say, John will come on to drill into the subject in a little bit more depth. But these are my views. Okay, so usually they'll already be handling or dealing with the stores that you want to approach in a certain market. Potentially, they'll handle importation, warehousing, and perhaps further marketing and promotion of your product. We're not really talking about wholesalers here. We're talking about people that have warehousing, staff, they may have sales reps, they may have the ability to produce support materials in a local language, etc. Agents are a little bit different, and again, John will come on to that in his subject. Rough rule of thumb on margins. One of the questions that I'm often asked is, well, if we're going to actually bring retailers and distributors on board, can you give us any idea how much we should have prepared for? Now, I'm not saying this is absolutely accurate. It's just my rough rule of thumb that when you're working out your margins for international distribution, I tend to work on around 15% for distributors, 10% for wholesalers further down the line, and 35% for retailers. This isn't verbatim. You may get a retailer that demands 50% and the distributor is happy to work on 10, etc., etc. It's really all about having a discussion, once you start having discussions with distributors or retailers. On to the next slide. Okay, just coming to the end of towards the end of my my session. I actually prepared this presentation for the the Going Global exhibition recently. So this plug for Open to Export isn't just because I was here today making the presentation. But one thing I always recommend to people that I talk to is just, if you're on Twitter, people like Open to Export, UKTI are great people to hook up with and just get that daily drip of information, that daily drip of guidance. Open to Export in particular have the Ask the Expert piece, and that's always great to ask questions. You'll hopefully always get responses from 2 or 3 people, be it about currency fluctuation, as this example I've got on the slide here shows. This is me that responded to this particular question. Okay, so keeping yourself up to date is vitally important. Okay, so just in summary, key stages in a relationship once you've got your retailer, in other words, account management. Finding and winning a retailer is all about making that link, and in the first couple of months of meeting and having Skype or telephone or even visits, you can expect to be talking about pricing and terms. Documentation is often key. Many retail groups like you to complete new line forms which look horrendous to begin with, but they're there to help you and to help them. It also helps clear up any uncertainties or misunderstandings. And also making sure that you're able to supply the retailer, they're able to receive it, and everything is running smoothly. And then further into the first year, strengthening the link with your relationship. start making suggestions about how you can create awareness plans for your product in store. Again, another question I get here is, well, surely that's going to cost, you know, thousands or hundreds of thousands of pounds. Believe me, if you have a product that a retailer likes, they'll be interested in creating those awareness plans for you or with you, and often at reasonable rates. Yes, sometimes you may get, you know, ridiculous proposals, but you know, that's for discussion. Staff training, promotions in store. These are often done via web links these days if it is an international retailer, but sometimes, you know, getting on a flight to Madrid with EasyJet for £80 is quite a good investment if you're going to cover a few of their stores in that city. And then ensuring that you're being paid promptly as well is key. So many times, you know, you're going to find that you're perhaps not getting paid on time, and when you quiz it, they had the wrong account number or whatever. Moving into the second year, I call it servicing the link. So, you know, you need to be proposing to the store what lines perhaps are not doing so well, and introducing other SKUs, stock keeping units is the kind of global term here, new lines that might replace those slow movers. So being proactive and not just sitting and hoping they won't notice. And also widening your contacts beyond just the buyer. So, you know, really a very successful supplier with any retail group, be it in the UK or group, you become very well known, you become the norm instead of just a supplier that's in the background. Okay, I think my final slide. So, building key retail partners can provide volume business in addition to your website. You need to decide what countries you think have opportunities for your products. Could be you have something that really appeals to retailers and distributors in Latin America, but I would suggest there's a lot out there in Europe, not far away, that, you know, you can start with. Don't be afraid to be speculative in your detective work to get a win-win. Okay, there's a bit of jargon there, but you know, the key word here is be speculative, be brave, and if you spot opportunities, you know, go for them. Always be looking for good distributor partners, either to support you before you go in, or once you've made the contact, once you've seen the opportunities. And then remember to constantly consolidate and strengthen the links that you've won, be it with retailers or distributor partners. It doesn't take much once a week to email your partner or call your partner, and maybe once a quarter to have a kind of formal quarter-of-an-hour review of how the business is going, but don't just leave it to be dormant. And finally, get help and education, not just from bodies like UKTI and Open to Export, but from, you know, people like ourselves. I'm only too happy to help. And I think it's just, my final slide is just, yeah, that's just a little bit about us. So that's just a bit of PR. So I hope that helped stimulate a few thoughts and ideas, and we'll have questions at the end. Thank you very much, Ian.
Thanks very much, Steve. That was a really good overview. So now, without any further ado, I think we're probably ready to hand over to John.
Yes, just a very, very quick hello. You can see me also in that slide with a guy over in the west side of Finland when I was doing a training exercise for a group of digital and media companies. And that was largely about how do we find sales contacts in the market, how do we distribute our product, how do we get it to market. Move on to the next slide, Ian. Thank you. I think Ian covered some of this ground earlier, but I've been in international selling for a long time, and as well as the main points about how many countries I've sold to and what products I've sold, etc., etc. I think the really key one here is the fact that I'm still doing it. I'm still out there for companies in the marketplace, traveling for them, selling for them, setting up their selling networks. Next slide, please. Before I move on through the contents here, I just wanted to add something to some of the work that Steve did earlier. I had an experience when I was setting up a company to sell into the retail supermarkets in France, and the message to you to enhance Steve's messages is that not all retailers operate the same. Some retailers will operate from a central office, and some retailers, as I found out in France, prefer to operate regionally. So get to know where people operate as well as how. On to my own presentation. I'm going to review what I said in the previous session on agents and distributors last year, which I called It's Your Show 1. It is your show. You are in control, and if you feel that you're not in control of a situation, then you need to review it. But we'll come on to that shortly. We have a section on sales agents, and really the legal side of working with sales agents is really quite important to get your heads around. And then moving on to distributors, we're talking about the types of clauses you'll have in an agreement with a distributor, the questions for each of those groups, sales agents and distributors, that you should be asking them in order to establish whether they're right for you or not, and then also the pros and cons of using one or the other or both. And finally, selection, motivation and management again was touched on last time, but it's well worth reviewing. Okay, Ian. The strategy review is very, very simple. This slide is there for you to have a look at and just really choose where you sit within that within those groups. On the left-hand side, you've got your market strategies. On the right-hand side, you've got your product strategies. For example, you may want to sell multiple products into a single market through a single distributor. That's going to have one set of costs. If you were to sell in a different way into multiple markets, then it may cost you more. And it's very important to be aware of the costs of entering a market or potential costs before you start doing the work. One example I can think of is a comparison between setting up in one of the largest South American markets like Brazil and setting up in a European market. There can be a significant cost difference, not least because it can take you several years to break into a South American market, even if you have the language skills. It's just the way it is. So which of these strategies apply to your markets, which is the most relevant? And then look at your resource, because you may not have the resource to do everything that you want to do. Okay, Ian? I think the figure on UK SMEs is that 97% of all companies in the country, in this country, are SMEs, and 96% of the SME companies employ fewer than 10 people. So resource is a real issue. I recently did, and I'm still doing work for a company in North Yorkshire, and I set up their operation in North America. I think I visited there 3 times before I took the managing director across with me, because a managing director, a sales director, any director of a company is a vital resource that is to be used sparingly. So one of the things that we bring to the party is to be able to go and do that work for them. It's a little bit like employing a salesperson specifically to do your international trade, and what you should all be aspiring to is to work with or to employ a sales director who's going to eventually take on that mantle for you. Why do we use overseas selling partners? And one of the reasons for it is just that. It helps you to build your resource in overseas market, and it helps you to preserve your resource in your home market. It also enables you to reach a much larger catchment with your products and services. And in my experience, if you appoint the right selling partners, it really does build your business, and we'll come on to talking about that in a short while. You can be territorially focused, giving a selling partner a specific territory. You can say, well, distributor or sales agent A sells into the healthcare sector, while distributor or sales agent B sells into hotel and leisure. or you can give each a product focus, one product range for one set of selling partners and another product range for another. It's not always easy to do, but it's very often useful to have more than one representation in a country. Next slide. I'm not a solicitor. I stress this at the outset for the simple reason that some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about now, if you decide to go ahead and confer any legal status on an overseas selling partner, you really should be taking some kind of legal advice. I'm going to just take you through three potential statuses here. The first is non-exclusive, and put the boot on the other foot. If somebody came to you and said, I would like to confer non-exclusive status on you within this territory of the UK, how would you feel? I think I'd feel undervalued. I think I would want to have assurances of what was meant by non-exclusive, etc. But really the non-exclusive tag is there for a number of reasons. One, it enables you to assess a selling partner before you make a formal appointment. Secondly, it gives you the opportunity to do what I suggested earlier in selling one set of products to one distributor or agent and another set of products to another. And the other point, which is very, very important in selling overseas, is that you must have the ability to sell directly into the market as well as anybody who you appoint. One of the things that you will always get asked by a new selling partner, almost on first meeting them, is if we decide to sell for you, can we have exclusivity? And exclusivity is very often a much misunderstood term, so I'm going to define it here. Excuse me one moment. What exclusivity means, if you give exclusivity for a territory, it means that there is only that one selling partner that you can sell through in that territory. Even you are not able to sell directly into that territory if you give that selling partner exclusivity. In some cases, providing exclusivity to the right selling partner is a really good thing to do, because they will take all the weight off your shoulders for that market. But in order to get there, you've got to trust them, and they've got to be part of your business. They've got to buy into your ethics. So a halfway house, and a very useful halfway house between non-exclusive and exclusive, is sole, which means that you can have a sole distributor or agent in a territory, one person to cover that territory, but it does still enable you to sell directly into that market. My view has always been that exclusivity must be earned. You can't just offer exclusivity without knowing what the performance of a potential partner is. Moving on in. A sales agent, we're going to talk separately about sales agents and distributors, so I'll start with the agents. You can see there that there are two relationships really. There's the relationship with the sales agent themselves, and there is the relationship directly with their customers. This is important because you sell to their customers, and on the basis of those orders, you give the sales agent a commission that you've agreed. So there are multiple relationships. Next slide in. We'll talk a little bit later about the pros and cons of that, but the driving force behind the European Commercial Agents Directive of 1986 were the French and the Germans. But in order to make just a small point about territorial organization, if you're working with a sales agent in either of these countries, then they tend to operate on postcodes. If you look at the right, you'll see Germany, and look at the yellow one where you see numbers or postcode references of 18, 16, 19, 14, 15. They're all grouped nicely and very Germanically together. So if your sales agent says, I can do territories or postcodes 14 to 20, then generally speaking, they're all going to be in the same area. Now pan across to the left and have a look at the French market. You can't do that because their postcodes are all over the place. So when you appoint somebody to cover a number of postcodes, let's take Provence down in the southwest there. You can see that the postcodes that apply are 06, 64, 84, and so on. So it's a way of getting to know exactly what territory you're ring fencing for them. Moving on. The European Commercial Agents Directive was implemented into UK law in 1993. It significantly strengthened the position of sales agents, and that's something you really need to be aware of. Sales agents can be absolutely superb for your business, but it can also be very difficult to terminate the contract of a sales agent who is not performing. Again, make sure you take legal advice when you come to appoint a sales agent within Europe. It's a very important thing to check. This applies to products only, the Commercial Agents Directive. It does not apply to services. And if you don't specify the law of the contract, of any contract that you sign or present, then the contract can default to the local country law. So just be aware of those few points. Moving on. There are a number of questions here. I have about 100 questions that I ask potential selling partners, and it can be a whole range of them, but key to any relationship is trust. So it's important at the outset to find out some very important things about how they will sell your product. What competitive brands do they sell is a really good one. I remember working with a guy in Greece, and he was looking like a really good distributor until I went to meet him. And I realized he had such a massive basket of products that were competitive to mine that I couldn't rely on him to dedicate time specifically to my set of products. So how much time are they going to dedicate to selling your products is another issue that you need to nail down with them. You can have as many questions as are relevant to your business. I've just thrown half a dozen down here for you to have a look at. One of them, if you're working in the public sector or you're working in construction, it's very useful to have somebody who's accustomed to completing tenders and that knows the tender process locally. Next slide, Ian. Pros and cons. I'm going to pick out just a couple. Generally, sales agents are lower cost than using a distributor. They are unlikely to stock your products, although that's not an exclusive issue. One of the cons is that because you're dealing with a sales agent's customers, gaining credit insurance means that if you have to get credit insurance on their orders, then you're going to have to get it with every single one of those customers, whereas with a distributor you have a single or a small number of points of contact. It is quite easy to control the workload of a sales agent. Generally speaking, there's a very close relationship between a principal and a sales agent, and that is it is quite useful. I've listed it there as a con, and the reason for that is that sometimes sales agents are actually controlled by a distributor that you may appoint as well. So there are pros and cons in the same point there. But you pay them on the results, and so you don't lose any money. You don't have to pay anything out to your sales agent necessarily until you've got the orders. Moving on. Here the distributor model is different. You can see there that there's one relationship, or there might be several relationships, but you're working through a single point of contact with a distributor. If you have 4 distributors, you've got 4 points of contact. If you have to get credit insurance on your distributor, that's much simpler too. But you have less transparency, I guess, with a distributor, because you are not selling directly to their customers. You're selling to the distributor is distributing your product to their customers. Okay, moving on. I thought I'd just highlight a few typical heads of agreement when you're setting up an agreement with a sales agent, with a distributor specifically. The there are a number of key ones, and the ones that I think you ought to concentrate on are the responsibilities. What are the responsibilities? What do you expect from your distributor, and what should they expect from you? Remember, the word agreement, an agreement is always between two parties, so there has to be a balance there. Always put in sales or purchase targets. That's vital, because otherwise you've got nothing to monitor performance on. If you put £100,000 in the first year and they achieve 80, then probably that's a pretty good result. So don't mark them down on that. Review it and say that because we're now moving into the second year, we expect you to bolster your performance, so we're going to give you an even more impossible target, and we hope you can reach it. Termination, make sure your termination clauses are absolutely clear, and with every agreement there should be an entire agreement clause. Basically what that means is that this agreement supersedes any other agreement, verbal or written, that has gone before, and it's a clarity point more than anything else. Moving on in. Again, a number of key questions. There are many, many questions. Some of these may not be relevant to your business, but think about these questions. Think about what you need to ask people who may want to represent your products, because it is very important. For me, one of the key ones with a distributor is, are you prepared to invest in stock? If the answer to that is no, then they're not really a distributor. So you need a commitment from a distributor, because presumably you're going to be giving away a large percentage to them for the privilege of them selling your product. So it's important that that there's a two-way street here, and that they're prepared to earn their money. Excuse me one moment. A second point is that, do they have dedicated staff who they employ that will be dedicated to selling your product or service? That's really key, because otherwise you may get lost in, well, two things may happen. They may say, yes, we do have salespeople who will be dedicated to your product. Ask them if they are employed or if they work as sales agents or manufacturing reps. There is a difference. A company who employs people makes them go out there and sell. It's a much better relationship in my view. And finally, what technical resource may they have? Because you may need installation services, you may need engineering services, you may need repair services that you don't want to manage from the home market. Moving on. A few pros and cons here. A good distributor will hold stock, and they will promote and market your products. They will do exhibitions for you, and they will be the visible presence of your company in that market, either under their own name, or maybe they'll even agree to work under your name. So have a look at that. They will create a much larger catchment for your products. The downside, if there is a downside, is that they will cost you more than a sales agent. I'm not going to put percentage figures on this because they are by negotiation, but typically what Steve said earlier in the retail trade is certainly true. In construction, you tend to find that 30 or 40% for a distributor will be acceptable, but make sure a distributor distributes and that they don't just put your products on the shelf in a warehouse. It's very, very important that you know what they're doing and that you know their markets at least as well as they do. And finally, on the con side, a distributor can control your pricing to a degree. So it's very important to, within the agreement that you set with them, to understand what their margins are going to be, and they're not going to add more margin for whatever reason. Okay, moving on. This really is the final slide, and it's really to give you a few pointers on the selection, motivation and management of your selling partners, whether they're sales agents or whether they're distributors. There will be a little bit of repetition in here, but please excuse that. You will know from talking to somebody whether they have industry experience or not, and it's really important that they do. Very often, if you're doing an overseas exhibition, you'll get bombarded with people who want to represent your products. The ones that tend to arrive first at the exhibition tend to be those who are the most, not desperate, but they really want to get hold of your product for whatever reason. So take time in your appointments. Don't rush into anything. People will always talk big numbers because they're salespeople, but take time, get to know the real business, and then build from there. Once you've actually appointed a selling partner, make sure, back to that agreement, make sure that there are sales targets in place, but also in return, make sure you're giving those agents or distributors some kind of incentive to sell for you, because you can bet your bottom dollar if they're representing complementary products or worse, competitive products, that they will be going where the money is. That is how it works. In terms of managing the relationship, communicate with them regularly, interact on social media, Skype most of all, and most importantly of all, please go and visit them, get on a plane, get on a boat, go and see them in order to build the relationship for the long term, because if you do it that way, then like is the case with many of the guys I've been working with for 20, 30 years, not anymore, but you always know that you can go back and gain help from those sources because they're trusted sources and they become your friend. Are they your only show in town? You remember what I said at the start of this presentation, it is your show. You are in control, and hopefully some of the points I've made within this presentation have helped to give you that impression. Your distributors, your agents are only as good as their performance, so be prepared to review, be prepared to arrange to move on. Next slide. It's really just saying thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, obviously we're happy to take those through the Open to Export system. Just a very quick plug for Open to Export. There is a terrific action plan on the Open to Export website. I would encourage every single one of you to take yourself through that action plan, not least because there is a £3,000 cash prize at the end of it potentially, but also because as somebody who's been involved in business internationally for 30 years, I did this exercise and I found that it reminded me of stuff that I should be doing. So I may have 30 years experience, but I'm still learning. Thank you.
Right, thank you, John, and thank you to Steve for a really in-depth and wide-spanning presentation. I think we covered an awful lot there, and we've had a few questions come through. So now I'm going to pose these questions to our panelists. And do remember, you can ask your questions using the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We will try to get to as many of these as we can in the next few minutes. And remember, we shall also be posting your questions onto the Ask the Experts section of the website, where they will receive answers from various other places too. So without any more ado, let's get to the first question that we've had in. So actually I'm going to combine a couple. Jason was asking about the reasonable margin to expect from an agent to make between them and retail, which I think was covered by Steve. But he's also asking what you would consider to be a reasonable order value to have in order for someone to get an exclusive deal in their location.
Can I take that one?
Yes,
Ian,
go
can
ahead,
I take
John.
that? Okay, thank you. Jason, thank you for your question. I'm going to be horribly predictable and say it depends on the market that you're in, the market sector that you're in, and the value of an individual product. My view is that if you're, for example, selling construction materials, you should be looking at no less than £100,000 per year as a turnover value for that market. Whether they hit that in year one is entirely another matter. If you're in fast-moving consumer goods retail, it could be very much more than that, even though the unit prices are likely to be much less. So it's a very difficult question to answer, and probably one that requires a dissertation on behalf of one or the other of us. Over to you, Steve, for comments.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, perhaps more on the making sure you get paid. I know you touched on it, John, but another key point in Jason's question is ensuring that your first order is cash in advance. We didn't talk much about letters of credit, but that's a possibility, but just making sure you get paid. I think John touched on it with exclusivity. You've got to make your people work hard on it. I've worked with a company or companies where we've given exclusive distribution. They are the only distributor. We relied totally on them, and they were turning over anything from £500,000 to £2 million with us. So you've got to make them earn it. I hope that helps.
Thanks, guys. That was really good, comprehensive response to that question, I think. Right now, the next question. Peter is asking, is there any advantage to having a larger company act as an agent? We'll state that first. John?
Do you want me to take that, Steve?
Yeah, go ahead.
There can be, but again, it depends on the business that you're in. And also the markets that you're targeting. Germany, one of the things that they do in Germany is very often, if you want national coverage, a single point of contact is required to control a group of sales agents. I remember selling in the carpet industry through a distributor in Kiel, and what he used to do was to disseminate information and product folders and everything out to his 14 sales agents around the country, and every 6 months we would meet in the middle of Germany. So it can work to your advantage to work with a larger company. I think you'll also find that there can be an issue of hunger. If a sales agent is an industry professional and they need your business, then the chances are that they are going to work very long hours to make sure that your product is sold. If you're working with a larger company, you've got to be sure of the issues I talked about in my presentation to do with how much time are they going to dedicate to selling your product.
Yeah, Steve here. Steve here. I would add to that. I mean, when with Polaroid, I was managing the distributors across EMEA. There was an interesting thing you had to balance, and I hope this helps to illustrate it. I called it share of voice. What share of voice are you getting from that distributor? I'm talking distributors here more than agents. And as an example, the classic situation is where we had a bigger market, we may have a bigger national distributor. You had to go there and fight to be heard and be pitching things that were interesting to them to drive them to sell your product. You may get a small distributor in, and I don't mean to belittle somewhere like Malta, but being a small market, we may get a smaller company, and they would devote their family to you. So it's really about getting that balance right. And I call it share of voice. So remember that perhaps.
Great, thanks for those answers, guys. Right, I'm going to combine a question that seems to be being asked by quite a few people. A lot of people are asking about sourcing distributors beside the UKTI website, saying, are there any other resources out there where people can seek trading inquiries or find directories for European sales agents, that kind of thing that you know of and you can share with?
Perhaps I can start with this one, John. One of the things that I say is, what's your competition doing? Have a look at your nearest competitors to whatever industry you're in. Who are they using? Now, you might say, well, what good is that? You don't want to use, well, in some cases, you may do if you've got a market that is small or different. But I think that's a good starting point to get a feel for what type of distributors your competition is using. And then for me, going back to my detective hat, it's about turning every stone over, pursuing a government website, just Googling distributors Germany cosmetic products, and then seeing if there's any overlap between the different types of research you're doing. I'm afraid it is about groundwork. It is about getting the deer stalker and the magnifying glass out and just doing a little bit of detective work.
Thank you, Steve. I'd like to add to that. One of the things about most markets, most of you will sell into niche sectors, and you may be selling new products, or you may have existing products that are going to be new to the market that you're targeting. In either of those cases, the chances are that most of the main selling partners are already working for your competitors. So how do you break through that? There are a number of ways that you can. One is by offering something significantly better than your competitors are offering and being able to sell that. Secondly, price comes into it every time. I don't really like to sell on price because it seems to say something about the quality of a product that you're offering, but it can be a useful weapon. But mainly, have a look at trade associations. Have a look at the trade press. Who's advertising where? How much do you think they're spending on advertising? Are they taking full pages? Are they taking quarter pages? Are they taking a minor ad in the back page classifieds? There are many little pointers that can tell you how good or bad or large or small a particular agent distributor may be. So look at those things. And also don't forget there are other search engines than Google. I found that Yahoo, now Bing, can be very, very useful specifically for French markets. I've found that Google can contain far too much, not trash, but too much irrelevance before you actually get to where you want to be. And very often when I'm doing research, I start on page 10 and work backwards because you tend to find things quicker that way. And also don't forget some of the directories. There are a lot of rubbish directories out there, but the one that I found, particularly in Europe, is quite good, is europages.com. Europages tend to, or people who advertise there tend to be really quite serious because some of them are spending some serious money in getting their message across Europe. So those are my tips.
Thank you for those great answers. Right, let's have a look. Oh, we've actually had a question come in that's directed to John, but I'm sure Steve will want to answer it as well. It's saying, does John have any examples of successful incentives that could be used with distributors?
Yeah, one of them is payment terms. I was working in Batimat in Paris in 1997, and we had the same Turkish distributor come onto our stand every single day, and they became a bit of a pain. But they're very good salespeople, very persuasive, but they weren't for us at that time. And 6 months later, a guy who's still a very, very close friend came along and he phoned me up and he said, do you mind, I'm in the country, can I come to see you in your office in Accrington? So I let him come along, and I warned the board that this guy was coming over from Turkey. If he was any good, I was going to introduce them to them, etc., etc. To cut a long story short, I started him on letter of credit only or payment up front. It's one of those two, because I didn't know this distributor from Adam, even though they were a part of a very big group. The trust level hadn't been built up, but he said within 6 months you'll have your first £50,000 worth of orders. And I thought, yeah, right. But within 6 months I had 50,000 quid's worth of orders because he was a good guy and he motivated his team to go out and sell for us. And so towards the end of that period, I sat down with him in Istanbul and I said, we need to make it more attractive for you to sell for us. I know that a £10,000 open account isn't much, but I'm prepared to risk that on you as long as anything above £10,000, the large orders, are all covered by a letter of credit. And so what we did is we credit insured him for the £10,000 so we'd get it back anyway if he defaulted, but he went away thinking that that's a win situation, that's really good. And within 3 years he was on £100,000 worth of, not unsecured because we had it credit insured, but he could trade on open account up to £100,000 within the payment terms that we had set. And anything bigger than that, the big single orders, we always did on a letter of credit. And so there's a way of building incentive into any agreement. In the retail trade, and I'm sure Steve will endorse this, there are a whole range of incentives that you can use to encourage people to sell your product above your competitors. And I'm not talking about brown paper bags, I'm talking about better marketing material, market support, good merchandising, all this kind of thing. I hope that's answered your question anyway from my perspective. Steve?
Just to, yeah, absolutely. And just to add to that, in terms of non-monetary, in my experience, one of the best incentives for a distributor is a visit. I know you can't always travel the globe, but especially in Europe, if you're able to do a cheap flight somewhere, look somebody in the eye, I found that to be the most effective. Rule of thumb, but by the way, and also if you're a company that's in a position to have one or two distributors throughout Europe or through the world, sometimes it's quite good to invite them. The rough rule of thumb is that, generally people pay for their flights to visit a market. You might put them up for a night and perhaps have a venue where you have 4 or 5 distributors together. Don't be afraid to bring distributors together if you feel that would work. Different markets coming together in one room, sharing ideas about your product. But that may be on a later stage. I'm sure a lot of you are more in startup mode. But I'm just sprinkling some seeds. But I have found personal contact to be a great motivation.
Can I just add to that as well, Steve, because I completely endorse what you say. We brought across 10 people from a distributor in Russia. They're from all corners of Russia. I went over to train them on at least 3 occasions, both with and without customers. And we brought them over to the UK to train them on how we did things here so they can get a really good grounding. And they were fantastic. They turned over £400,000 in the following year from the previous year of about 70. So it really made a difference. And it helped them to buy into your company because they knew who you were speaking to on the phone. They knew the customer services people, they knew the guy who sent them the samples because we introduced them to everybody and they felt part of a really good team.
Great, thanks guys for answering that question for us in such great detail. I think we've just about got time for one more question. Don't worry everybody, we will be posting your questions onto the Ask the Experts forum so you will receive an answer to anything you posted. So final question for today is, how easy is it to manage multiple selling partners in the same country?
That's a really, really good question. And the answer is it can be. One of the things that you need to do is to make sure that the lines between each of them are very, very clear. We're working on a project at the moment where we're selling into the Middle East. And I talked earlier about healthcare versus hotel and leisure. They're very different markets, they have very different ways of working. Healthcare tends to be public sector driven largely, and even where the private hospitals are building premises, they're following a model that's not dissimilar. In retail, we're actually working with a guy on healthcare and we're working with a guy on retail. The retail guy is stocking, and the guy in the healthcare, he can't stock because the projects, they tend to be much longer term, but they are prepared to stock as and when those projects take shape. In the meantime, for smaller projects, we've got the 2 companies working together, the retail and the healthcare sector representatives. So if the healthcare needs a renovation project, then they can take stock from the local retail guy. So there is a way of doing it. Again, it's about making the lines really, really clear between the 2 and not disguising the fact that the 2 of them are in the same market. Be completely open, completely transparent, and that is the way that, and help them to work together, help them to build a relationship together, because then you will find that it will succeed long term. And it's in both of their interests to make sure that any clashes of interest are resolved as soon as possible, as soon as they arrive.
Yeah, just to add to John's point, Steve here, clarity, transparency is key. Don't be setting up somebody in one corner of a country and another. You need to be, I think you need to be open and clear. As an example, I was at Polaroid, I think I mentioned, I lived in the Middle East for 5 years. I had 2 years in Saudi and I managed the distributors there, and it was very much a segmented market. So we had a consumer goods distributor, we had a business distributor for our business products, and we had a healthcare distributor. So very often, the market can be segmented by business type or geography, you know, equally as we saw on John's maps. You know, it's not it wouldn't be unusual if you had a big market to say, okay, you've got Germany south, you've got Germany north, etc. But you need to be clear and transparent. Hope that helps.
Right, on that note, thanks for those answers, and I think it's probably time for us to wrap up. I'd like to remind everybody that we will also be posting these questions on our forum after this webinar, so please do keep your eyes peeled for these and let us know if you'd like to withdraw your questions from this process. Thanks once again to Steve and John for their presentations and answers. It was really great to be able to present today's attendees with both strategic and tactical solutions to important export challenge. Don't miss our next webinar. It's on June the 14th and it's on the important topic of shipping and documentation. And finally, another reminder, there is still time to enter the Export Action Plan competition. This is a chance for your business to win £3,000 and other prizes to grow your business overseas. The grand final will take place at the International Festival for Business in Liverpool on the centrepiece Blue Skies stage, on what should be a very exciting day. The last competition final was really inspirational and it was great seeing our tools and content to help exporters to take the next step to export. So please do inspire us again with your export plans by entering your plans into the competition. That's all from us for now. Please take our survey as you exit and let us know what you thought of the webinar and give us any suggestions for improvements or future topics. Thank you for attending and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.